objects to it is Sir Alfred Chatterton, who was the principal of the College of Engineering, Guindy, whose photograph you see there. He is appointed as the Director of Industries, Government of Madras in 1911. The Government of Madras is really the first government in India to have a Directorate of Industries. And that was in 1911 with Alfred Chatterton as its first director. Chatterton says Indians have to start manufacturing, and he says Swadeshi is not a bad thing. Can you believe it? An Englishman saying that Swadeshi is not a bad thing during the height of the Swadeshi movement. And he finds that Indians do not have the wherewithal to start an industry. They are good in trade, but they are afraid of starting a company. So he says, if that is so, let's start the industry ourselves. So the government starts the Madras pencil factory, whose advertisement you see there. And long before Churchill, Chatterton had come up with the statement, India expects every man to do his duty. And the pencil factory did not have the suitable quality of wood. Wood was imported from Africa, and graphite came from Sri Lanka. The factory was set up in North Chennai, and it was a success. It ran for 2 years. Then Chatterton auctioned it off. The person who bid for it was V. Perumal Chetty and Sons. And that is how the first Indian manufacturing facility came up in Madras. In the meantime, Madras Chamber appealing to the government in Calcutta that the Directorate of Industry should be abolished because it is a negative impact on British business interests. So for 2 years the Directorate is abolished, but it comes back shortly thereafter. And Chatterton is knighted because of all the work that he does. Today he would have been shunted to Department of Museums or some such thing if he had been done any such thing. And Chatterton also says that we should start he is the pioneer of a method of curing leather, which is chrome tanning in leather. And again the chamber opposes it, and there is a member of the chamber, Mr. Chamber, who is actually the person who runs a leather factory here, and he says that this chrome leather tanning is the worst possible process, completely unsuited to Indian conditions. It cannot be used here. Chatterton proves that chrome leather is the best possible method for Indian leather. And finally, Chamber adopts it himself, sets up a factory in Chromepet. And that is how the Chromepet leather factory comes into existence. So Chatterton really, if at all there ought to be a statue for someone on the marina, I think it should be Chatterton. In the meantime, the harbour is showing up its own problems. The gate is silting up, cyclones are not getting protected. And finally, the general manager of the Madras and Southern Maratha Railway, M&SM Railway, he becomes the chairman of the Port Trust, Sir Francis Spring. And the Madras Chamber is all behind him for a complete reconstruction of the harbour. You can see the harbour arm, you can see the two arms going up and then curving like that. And on top of the slide was where the eastern arm used to be, the eastern opening used to be. Sir Francis says that we must have a northeastern entrance at right angles to the direction of the sea, so that we are completely protected from the cyclones and also from silting. So the harbour is reconstructed in that fashion, and it gets completed in 1914, just as the First World War is going to start. And Sir Francis Spring retires and goes back to England, leaving behind a harbour that would transform Madras forever. Because at the end of in the First World War, you all know that the Emden comes in through the harbour, bombs it and all that. The history of Eastern Command in the Second World War would have been entirely different. We have no idea about that. But what we do know is that the population of Madras doubled during the Second World War. It was 4.5 lakhs prior to the Second World War. It was 9 lakhs at the end of the Second World War. All the defense establishments were set up here. The American troops were stationed here. Cinematography, the what do you call it, CVRD, the father of CVRD, which is the heavy vehicles factory in Avadi. Incidentally, Avadi has nothing to do with armoured vehicles and defence of India and all that. It was a village called Avadi, which existed even in the 1860s, much before all this was thought of. But that became a defence enclave. Industry boomed in Madras entirely because of this harbour that the Madras Chamber created. And we have never looked back after that. In 1909, we have a book which says Madras has no future because it has no harbour. And in 1945, we are a city that has survived the Second World War, and we have proven that we are capable of carrying on trade. But I must get on with the rest of the story. As I said, Binni and the Perambur railway workshops employed 30,000 people. That was a time when workers had to work all 7 days of the week, and every shift was for 12 hours. And the workers would go for lunch. This was in 1918. The workers would go for lunch for 15 minutes. And the only form of entertainment that the laborers in the factories had were bhajana mandapams that existed all around the factories. Even today, if you go around what was Binni at one time, you will find any number of bhajana mandirams all around it. They used to go and sing. That is what they would do. They would sing the praise of God. Venkateshwara Gunamrita Bhivarshini Sabha was one of those organizations. And that is where Venkat Ramanjulu Naidu, who was the organizer of that Sabha, along with Selvapati Chettiar, overheard two workers talking in 1917 about how their overseer in Binni and Company does not allow them a break of more than 5 minutes for lunch. He then takes it up with Annie Besant and B.P. Wadia. These two people take it up with Annie Besant and B.P. Wadia. And they say that we must organize some form of protest. And that is when in 1918, India gets its first labor union. It's called the Madras Labor Union. And a strike is organized at Binni and Company. The chamber, of course, reacts in the best traditions of the chamber. There's a worker, and you should see some of the documentation of that time. The Indian worker is forever interested in doing nothing, which is why he is organizing strikes. And Kenneth K., he's buried in St. George's Church. Sometimes when I go there, I stand before his grave and think of what kind of a personality he must have been. Most poisonous, the chairman of the chamber. He's really the most vituperative of the lot. So this is the headquarters of the Madras Labour Union. This building was built in 1930. It's in Strahan's Road. It's now on its last legs. It's come down to the first floor now. And trees are growing all around it. But this is where the strikes were organized. The strikes then spread to the tram service, the electricity service, then the railways, and all of them are members, chambers members. And so the great discussions happen in the chamber as to how are we call the army, call this, call that, etc., etc. And finally, as a counter to the Madras Labour Union, they start what is known as the Employers Federation of South India. So if they can represent their rights, we can represent our rights as well. So that is how the labour movement really spreads. Then comes the civil disobedience movement. Mahatma Gandhi saying, picket all foreign goods. And how do you get around that? So all the Indian agents of Binni meet up with Mahatma Gandhi. The chamber organizes that. And they say that Indians are going out of work. We are going to become impoverished. Gandhi says Binni is an Indian product. Don't boycott it. And so Binni survives the civil disobedience movement. So this is the kind of thing that goes on. In the meantime, chamber is becoming bigger. It is having trouble, but at the same time it's becoming bigger. It now has 2 seats in the Madras Legislative Council. Nominated membership from the Madras Chamber of Commerce, 2 seats in the Madras Legislative Council, 3 seats in the Corporation of Madras. So everything from the Buckingham Canal to the development of T Nagar all pass through the chamber's eyes. They keep giving their comments, they give suggestions. At a state or a presidency level, members of the chamber are all sitting at the Legislative Council participating in debates on what needs to be done and stuff like that. In the meantime, they are also involved in the introduction of telephones. If the first telegram was sent by Henry Nelson from Madras to Marseilles, the first international telephone call is made by the chairman of the Madras Chamber as well. It's made by Sir William Wright. He calls from Madras to London and speaks for 2.5 minutes with a stenographer listening at both ends and typing it out at the same time, so that there are minutes available across on what each has said to the other. And that is a clerk at the Arbuthnot at Binni and Company with a telephone at his desk. We introduced the suburban railways. Coming in 1930, the Beach railway station constructed with the blessing of the chamber, the height of the station not being taller than the chamber buildings on the opposite side, and in keeping with the architecture of the chamber. Can you believe the amount of power that we had at one time? Then in 1936 comes the centenary of the chamber, and they congratulate themselves by saying that when we started we had 2 Indians, we still have only 2 Indians. The chamber book says that. And this is the And the chamber book is edited and brought out by A. Hales, Arthur Hales, who was the editor of the Madras Mail at that time. It's a very slim but beautiful volume. A prized original edition, I think, is in the chamber today. And you don't have many copies of it even in Amazon or on auction houses. And it has some of the best black and white photographs of Madras taken in 1936 by photographers of the Mail. So it's a treasured copy. I would suggest that a high resolution version be digitized and kept as a digital record, and the original be preserved with the help of some kind of scientific method of preservation, so that we don't see. This is the first documentation of the chamber's history. In fact, the chamber, I would say, has been a lucky organization in the sense, discounting my own effort. This is one. Then comes the 150th year volume written by Thirumalai, which is the voice of enterprise, from where, you know, our title came, the championing enterprise, really. And that is a big volume as well. So 3 histories written across 3 different periods. So I think it's a very good effort at documentation. This work needs to be preserved. In 1936, the chamber congratulated itself on the fact that it had only 2 Indian members. But in 1937, it had to contend with the fact that elections were going to be held for the Madras Legislative Assembly. And Indians were going to come in large numbers. And what more, you had an Indian Prime Minister, C. Rajagopalachari. And what does he do? Imposes sales tax for the first time. Chamber highly incensed. If he is not satisfied with imposing sales tax, imposes prohibition also, so which is even worse. What do you do? How do you manage without planters' gin and whiskey of the best order? So chamber protests at every count, but nothing much is going to happen. That is Rajaji inaugurating the radio service, the corporation radio service, All India Radio in 1937, for which a chamber chairman is also present on that particular occasion because it's a landmark event. Chamber by this time, Arbuthnot has collapsed. Madras Mail has been acquired and moved out to Mount Road. Dregs of the underworld. Imagine leaving First Line Beach and going to Mount Road. So they then moved to the Mercantile Bank building, which is today the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. They are here for some time, and then they moved to the topmost floor in Parry and Company. And one of the minutes says that after lunch it is very difficult for the members to walk up that winding staircase. That's there in the minutes books. 1947, and finally independence comes. Chamber witnesses a complete transformation. It has to live with that. British members all leaving, business houses being sold. At that time, the Trades Association and the Chamber become friends. And from 1942, you see that the members of the Madras Trades Association become members of the Madras Chamber as well, and vice versa. So Simpson and Company, Addison and Company, all of which were never part of the Madras Chamber of Commerce, P.R. and Sons, Spencer's, they all become members of the Madras Chamber of Commerce because they need to protect their interests. Secondly, a lot of the British establishment had gone to fight the war and never come back. Those who died, and those who survived went on to life in England. They never returned to Madras. So the establishment was shrinking here on a daily basis. So they needed to protect their interests. So they all grouped together. Now, D.M. Reid was one of the last British chairmen of the pre-independent English chairman of the Madras Chamber. He was the director of Beardsell and Company. Reid was a lover of Indian history. And when he left in 1948, he sponsored the setting up of a museum inside Fort St. George for collecting all the archival material that the British had left behind. And that is how you have the Fort Museum today. He is the father of the Fort Museum. D.M. Reid also wrote a book called The History of Fort St. George. It's a small, slim volume. And that is one of the best volumes on walking around Fort St. George and identity. He was the chairman of our chamber as well. The chamber then moves from the Mercantile Bank building to Parry and Company. In 1938, Parry has demolished its old building and this building has come up. So this becomes the chamber's home where it lives for a long time. But it is also this